So, very warm welcome, and big thank you to Tom for agreeing to talk to us tonight. And he's going to be talking about curation of the dead in Bronze Age Britain. And I think the poster boy, the poster girl, poster boy, it has to be for this, when it was announced, when the paper was announced, was an object from our own collections. But over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks for hosting me here. It's good to be able to, when I conduct research on collections of this kind, to be able to deliver it back through the institutions that have sort of particularly supplied samples to try and, in part, to say thank you for none of this could be possible without good curation and archival of materials for long amounts of time, where the science to do these kinds of projects develops fairly slowly over time. So what I'm going to be presenting today mainly are the results of a project that I worked on with my co-author Joanna Brook while we were both at the University of Bristol as part of a Gerda Henkel grant that was given to Joe to look into this question of the curation of dead, and particularly bits of the dead, bits and pieces in Bronze Age Britain. I'm now at the Francis Crick Institute working on yet another ancient DNA project, and Joe's now moved to Dublin and the university there. But yeah, this was all sort of conducted in collaboration with what was then the newly opened radiocarbon dating lab at Bristol University, the Brams lab as well, where I learned to do some collagen extraction for radiocarbon dating there. So this project was inspired by the fact that quite often on Bronze Age contexts, we find just bits and pieces of the dead turning up in certain contexts. And this is usually, although not exclusively, crania and long bones, but there can be other elements as well. And it also includes sort of burnt remains, so cremations as well, where you often have turning up at certain sites sort of a small amount of cremated bone that would have been clearly recognizable as a cremation deposit, but wasn't heavy enough to account for a whole complete individual. So it seems like that in these cases the cremated bone has been divided, the cremation has been divided up amongst people and then eventually buried elsewhere. And a good example of the human remains, and a common place where you find human remains in addition to a burial, for instance, in this kist from Dryburn Bridge, where you have an articulated burial, and I'll try and go on to I'll just select my spotlight, there we go. Where you have an articulated individual that's been buried in the ground, and you have disarticulated bits of a second individual. And basically the way that this has been deposited suggests most of the bones of this person the second person aren't present. It just seems to have been a selection of bones that have been collected from elsewhere and buried alongside this burial here. So it's not like there was a burial in there previously and it was just moved to one side. It seems in this case that the fresh body was put in, and then these disarticulated human remains were retrieved from elsewhere and were sort of accompanying almost as grave goods with this body. So these turn up fairly frequently all the way through the Bronze Age to the earliest Iron Age. Let's see. So previous work I'd been involved in for my PhD research at the University of Sheffield with Mike Parker-Pearson was looking at evidence for the mummification of human bodies in the Bronze Age as well. And through a technique I'm going to discuss later, we found evidence that people were mummifying their dead relatively regularly in the Bronze Age and had an interest in preserving the remains for only a short while. I mean, it's likely you know, when people talk about mummification practices, they think of ancient Egypt and sort of very elaborate methods of preserving the dead. But what we're talking about here potentially is quite, what the evidence that we found for mummification was that they were doing things that maybe only would have preserved bodies for short periods of time, dunking them in bogs or smoking them over a fire, drying them out, just by leaving them outdoors for a while, those kinds of things, rather than the elaborate practices that we see in the Bronze Age. But these results sort of emphasize the evidence that people in the Bronze Age were interacting with the dead quite intensively and had an interest in preserving the remains, even if it was just for a short while. So the nature of these bits and pieces of bone that turn up on Bronze Age archaeological sites varies depending on the part of the Bronze Age that you're talking about. So in the Chalcolithic to early Bronze Age, the vast majority of evidence that we have comes from funerary sites. There is very little across Britain as a whole archaeological evidence for settlements. I mean, we know there must have been settlements, but a lot of the time it seems like they leave only an ephemeral archaeological trace. So a lot of these bits and pieces of bone turn up in graves, so in kists or underneath in earthen graves, in round barrows. Whereas from the Middle Bronze Age to the earliest Iron Age, these bits and bones tend to turn up on settlements. The evidence is sort of reversed in that you get much less evidence for these grand funerary monuments and funerary behavior in general, and you have much more evidence for settlement. And then when you get settlement, you also get human remains turning up on them, sometimes in pits, sometimes in the post holes of houses, or in ditches or in wells, or sometimes in ditches surrounding field boundaries. So it's a kind of more settlement-based evidence for these human remains in that period. It's difficult to say whether that is a definite split between the Chalcolithic to early Bronze Age compared to the Middle to late Bronze Age and earliest Iron Age, because it could be that they are depositing human remains at settlements in the early part of the Bronze Age, but because we don't have the settlement evidence, we don't see it. Similarly, because we don't have many funerary sites or as many funerary sites in the Middle to late Bronze Age, it could be that we don't really pick up on the evidence so much. And some of these cases, in all cases, particularly in terms of graves, but also in terms of the settlements, there could be almost accidental inclusions. And in some cases, you know, like a finger bone or a toe bone might just get incorporated into a mixed deposit of material, and it could have been totally by accident. People may not have realized that this was human remains getting sort of incorporated into the deposit they were making, or put into they sort of accidentally cut through another grave and interred part of another individual in the new grave that they were cutting. So in certain cases that was definitely happening, but in other cases we see there seems to be a clear evidence of intention that like in those dry bone kist examples, bones have been sort of placed on. It's quite obviously human bones have been, not just little fragments, have been placed in and positioned in a particular way on a prepared surface. And in those cases, it's hard to dismiss those as being just accidental inclusions, that there must have been some intention associated with those remains. And so the question that we were trying to address with this project was whether these disarticulated human remains that we find in these contexts represent the end result of some prolonged funerary ritual. So you treat the remains in a particular way, either you bury them in the ground or you leave them to decay on the ground surface until the flesh is removed, and then you dig them back up again, or go and retrieve bones and then redeposit them wherever straight away as soon as they're defleshed. So it's kind of like this prolonged funerary ritual where the bones aren't really kept, they're just sort of redeposited elsewhere. Or do these reflect more sort of complex rites and interactions between the living and the dead, where bones being kept, retrieved and then kept for a while before they were deposited and used in ceremonies and rituals amongst the living, and kept amongst the living before they were eventually decided to be finally deposited wherever, in a grave or in a post hole or in a well. And if that was happening, what time scale was this happening over? Was this sort of hundreds, were people keeping these remains for decades or centuries or even millennia? So I'm using the Jeremy Bentham auto icon as a nice tool here, partly because that as a sort of curated human remain itself. So this is he was basically, his bones were boiled down and his head preserved, and his bones have been put inside this straw suit, and his head was originally stuck on top of his body, his preserved head, but was taken off because it was and replaced with just a wax head because it was regarded to be too gruesome, because they preserved it in a very strange way. But yeah, I use this as an example of a modern day curation, because that I was involved in sampling his head for DNA analysis fairly recently as well. So I have something in terms of thinking about interaction with the dead in the Bronze Age. You know, it's very much my forte now, 4,000 years later. So the way we wanted to approach this question of whether these human remains had been kept a long while or were just part of some elaborate funerary treatment was through radiocarbon dating. So it's in the main thing about radiocarbon dating is it gives you the date that the organism died, not the date that it was necessarily the date that it was deposited in the ground. So what our strategy was to essentially radiocarbon date these bits and pieces of human bone, and then radiocarbon date something that was put in the ground around the same time. So either a bit of animal bone or charcoal, or sometimes even just based on the artifacts which the human remains accompanied, and see whether there was a big discrepancy, because this would essentially give you the date of the radiocarbon date from the human remains would give you the date of death of the person, and the thing accompanying them will give you the earliest point at which those remains were put in the ground, were buried. So it was almost a conservative approach, because it could be that whatever we were dating that accompanied the human remains could have been kicking around for a while anyway, but at least it gives us sort of this is the earliest point at which it could have gone into the ground. So in fact, any discrepancy that we find could be larger than what we were finding. So essentially what we're doing was assessing whether any of these human remains were already old when they were buried. Like if I was, for instance, to be buried with Jeremy Bentham's head, if you radiocarbon dated Jeremy Bentham's head and radiocarbon dated me, there would be quite a significant 200-year offset. And then we can also use OxCal, this radiocarbon dating modeling program, to compare dates. So not only can we figure out, ask if the human remains are older, we can ask how much older are they. And what this does is produces this probability distribution like this, which gives you a sense of sort of calendrical years, of the range, the possible range of calendrical years between two samples. So you put it into the software, say what is the difference between these two dates, and it will tell you. And this was to try and get an idea of the distance between the person who died and the communities who eventually buried their remains, if it turned out that they had been kept for a while. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this was because we wanted to see what kind of timescales were driving any curation rites. If there was sort of a negligible difference between the date of death and date of deposition, that would suggest that we're not really looking at curation of human remains and retention of human remains. We're looking more at prolonged funerary rites. If it's decades to centuries, then it would suggest that for most remains, it would suggest that these were people who had lived, at least in cultural memory and maybe even within living memories of the communities that buried them. So it would emphasize this sort of a tangible connection to living people that made these human remains important. If it turned out that they were sort of centuries to millennia old, that would suggest that these were individuals who lived outside of living or cultural memory, and so maybe were more likely to be sort of comparable in terms of comprehension to sort of almost saintly relics, where there were remains of distant, sort of almost mythological people who were influential on sort of a quite large swathes of people, whereas decades and centuries would suggest something a bit more intimate, relevant to particular communities, and where, interestingly, you would expect then that the human remains would be retaining the identity of the person that they came from to some extent as well. Whereas to some extent, the centuries, if it was centuries and millennia, those human remains would have been anonymous, or there would have been some invented identity applied to them. And what we also wanted to see to sort of compare to this is how the dead were being treated in the first place. So, I mean, research in recent decades has shown that there was no real one way to treat the dead in the Bronze Age. We have evidence for synchronous practice of cremation, excarnation, that's exposure of bodies on the ground surface, burial, cremation and mummification. So all these things seem to be being practiced almost at the same time. Just how popular each one of those things is varies through time. We wanted to see if there was a specific way in which these disarticulated bits of bones, that whether the bodies were treated in a particular way to produce those. So whether there was a decision made when someone died that we want to curate their bones, and then we treat them in a particular way in order to essentially get clean bones, and then we can use them in other things. Or was it the case where people were sort of treated to a funerary rite that was decided to be appropriate for them based on their identity, and then a decision was made later to go and fetch the remains, either exhuming their remains or going and fetching bones from another location. But when the problem is that when you're only looking at sort of single bones, it's difficult to infer treatment with any kind of precision. So what I'll just start playing this video. What we use to investigate this is the microscopic analysis of the bones that we look at. So of some of the bones that we're also getting radiocarbon date. So what this method is most archaeological bones show intense tunneling by bacteria in their internal microstructural surfaces. And most of the time that ends up destroying the entire internal bone microstructure. So you can see in this video, this is basically a transverse section through a femur, so a slice through a partial femur bone. And a healthy femur bone would be all white, like this middle bit of material here, but you can see you've got all of this dark, teeming activity that's going on towards the edges, and that's basically as we're passing through the femur, this is the activity of the bacteria tunneling through the bone and attacking and eating away at the protein. And these bacteria may originate in ourselves. So when we die, the bacteria that are housed predominantly in our gut escape out into the rest of our body and begin devouring our soft tissue. So it could also be that they also get in the bone, or they could, in part or in whole, come from the soil and attack the bone from the soil. But in either case, experiments that I've done and analysis of archaeological remains suggests that the level of bacterial attack seems to be related to the extent to which the bone has experienced soft tissue decomposition. So it seems very much linked to early post-mortem treatment. So you can look at the extent to which a bone has been degraded or attacked by bacteria and infer how much soft tissue decomposition a bone has experienced. And this is important for thinking about funerary treatment, because different kinds of funerary treatment will expose the bone to different levels of soft tissue, bacterial soft tissue decomposition. If you bury a body in the ground, then you're essentially enclosing it in with all its rotting soft tissues. So the most bones from articulated burials like that show extensive levels of bacterial attack. If you deflesh a bone or leave a body to decompose on the ground surface, the flesh is removed very quickly. So either through just the removal of the flesh by a person, or through insect activity if the body is left on the ground surface. And what that means is that sort of the bones are stripped of flesh before bacterial soft tissue decomposition can really get going, and so you'll get much more limited bacterial soft tissue decomposition inside the bone. And this was part of the evidence that suggested that certain bodies had been mummified, and that you had these articulated bodies, so bodies that were still all in one piece, but that showed only minor levels of bacterial attack, suggesting that they hadn't experienced soft tissue decomposition. And the only way that we knew of to resolve that was that some of these bodies had been mummified, and basically there'd been some process that stopped the soft tissue decomposition and arrested the level of bacterial attack inside the bone. So we looked at some of the bones. Basically, we took the same samples that we were going to destroy through radiocarbon dating and scanned them in a micro CT scanner to look at this bacterial attack, so we could see how the bodies that produce these bones had been treated. In terms of the project as a whole, the radiocarbon dating part, we produced 82 new radiocarbon dates on both unburnt and cremated human bones, as well as the materials that they were associated with. And we combined this with 121 radiocarbon dates that were already sort of out there, that had already been done in the literature. And sometimes our new radiocarbon dates were done to sort of complement the ones that were already there. So if a human bone had been dated in a context, we would just date an animal bone from that context to compare it. And all the new radiocarbon dates were done, as I said, at the radiocarbon dating lab in Bristol, and were distributed broadly all around the country, although there were some obvious biases. So the main answer to the question, were human remains being curated, was yes. And the way we looked at this was, you can, in that same program, OxCal, basically ask it, because you essentially get date ranges for the date of deposition and the date range for the date of death, they can overlap to some extent. So basically you ask the software to say, oh yeah, all right, okay, this is old, the human bone is older than that, but is it significantly older? Is this probability distribution, is this range so much older that we can say definitely this was old when it went in the ground? And what we found of that was that there was you can see in this plot here, so these are the differences between the human remains and the date at which they were deposited, and all the orange probability distributions are the ones that were not only earlier but anomalously earlier, and the yellow ones are ones that weren't somewhat earlier but not anomalously so. In some cases we had sort of animal bones that were actually older, significantly older than the human bones, so there was clearly in some cases a problem that that old animal bones were being incorporated in a particular context. But the bias was definitely in the right direction, in that it was the human bones more consistently that were coming out as significantly old when they were deposited. And we tested this a number of ways and it held out as being a significant difference between what we would expect just to have occurred by random chance. So the question about, are human remains being kept, are human remains already old when they go in the ground in certain cases? And the answer is yes, it would seem that they are. But for how long were these bones being curated for? So we sort of just took all of these, what we did was take all of these distributions that you can see in this graph here and sort of pile them together to get a sense of what the average length of time these human remains were being kept for. And essentially it wasn't very long. So on average, it was they were being kept for about 65 years, between around either 0 generations distant or the maximum of 6 generations distant. So what we get a sense of here is that, yes, they were curating the human remains, but and potentially keeping them for a while before they were amongst the living, before they were deposited, but that this was only occurring within decades to at a stretch centuries after that person had died, up to maybe around 200 years or so. And you can see this in these probability distributions here. This just reflects that on average it was 65 years, although you have the distribution stretching out in either direction. So based on what I was talking about earlier, what this suggests is that this was the curation of people who probably existed within living or cultural memory. And it was that, I think, to sort of introduce some conjecture, it was probably that aspect, because it was so consistent in terms of the difference between the living and the dead, in terms of always being within this quite narrow, in relative terms, short time frame. It was usually people who lived within living or cultural memory, and then it was that identity and their relationship with the living people that gave these relics their power over time. And then perhaps these relics were then decommissioned by burial after, when that person began to pass out of either living or cultural memory. And so that would suggest that it was these tangible links people had with the dead that made them interesting and gave them their power. And once those tangible links started to fade away, then they were of little use and were deposited. And it seems like they weren't referencing, in the way that we think about saintly relics, sort of mythical, distant people who sort of had some kind of legendary status, but people who they had tangible relationships with. And this might give an interesting insight into the mindset of the people in Bronze Age Britain in terms of memory and what they regarded to be important, in that if it is the people with which you are most directly associated with in time whose remains are important, then those things are always, those relationships and those types of relationships for each generation are changing all the time. So you get a sense that people's identities and their reference points in terms of these sorts of rites were changing all the time through time, because they weren't sort of harking back to a sort of static ancient past, but a recent past which would have always been to some extent in flux. So we also did this bone microstructural analysis. So what this plot shows is when we assess the bacterial attack in the bones, we put it on a scale from 0 to 5, with 0 being the bone has been completely attacked by bacteria, to 5 where there's hardly any, if any, hardly any or no bacterial attack. So hopefully what you can see is that the samples that we looked at are bimodally distributed, in that there's lots that show no attack, and then there's lots that show lots of attack. And this distribution of bacterial attack is very similar to the same analysis performed on other Bronze Age human remains that have been looked at in previous studies. So it suggests that you've got these bones have come from people who've been treated in a diversity of ways. It seems like some people were buried in the ground, and then people went back to collect bits and pieces of bone. It seems like some people were left to decompose on the ground surface, and then someone came back and then collected parts of the bones, and some may have been defleshed or even mummified. So the sense that you get is that even with these curated bits of bone, all these people have been treated in the way that was thought appropriate in a whole variety of ways initially, and then maybe the decision to actually go and fetch their bones for curation or retention was made later, and so it was almost sort of considered as a separate rite. So we're not looking at specifically an extended funerary rite here. We're looking at what you might call mortuary rites, where it's not about the person's it's not a funeral rite in the sense you're concerned with the person's sort of passage into the afterlife and the appropriate treatment regarding that. It's about using these remains and fetching them and using them amongst your community, and what other rituals and ceremonies you can adapt them to be used with. And there's no evidence that there was any particular process that led to the creation of these defleshed bones. It was a whole variety of treatment, the whole rich spectrum of ways in which the dead could be treated, and then there's a decision to go and fetch the remains later. So that was also an interesting insight. And it's important because obviously the different contexts in which these bones were found gives you a different sense of what might have been going on in the nature of these sorts of rites. So as I said earlier, in the Chalcolithic to early Bronze Age, most of these bits and pieces of human remains come from graves. And the period of curation, or the age the bones were when they were reinterred in someone's grave, is usually a bit older than in later periods. And I think, as I'll discuss some of the evidence for this, but a lot of this was potentially the revisiting of old graves, that when people were buried, it wasn't necessarily thought of as being the last resting place, but also a cache of human remains that people could return to and fetch relics that could then be redeposited with newly dead people. And as I'll talk about in a couple of cases at sites, you have these potential mortuary houses or wooden boxes on a site where you have other burials. And in these mortuary boxes, what you often get is disarticulated bits and pieces of human remains. So these seem to be potentially acting as caches of human remains that you could then redeposit with other burials. So in this sense, it maybe wasn't so much, although we can't rule it out because it's the scarcity of settlements, that in this period that remains were being kept as often amongst the living, but that cemeteries were very much a place where you interacted with the dead, not just where you put the dead. There was one site from Cotswold Community College in Gloucestershire that was looked like it was probably a settlement site where you had two femurs or two thigh bones from the same person put in a pit with a bunch of beaker pottery. So that hints that this wasn't just restricted to funerary sites. This was also going on potentially on settlements as well. But that's the only evidence that we have it there. So we have to consider the possibility that in this period, there was a lot of just moving bones around between graves. Whereas in the middle of Bronze Age to the earliest Iron Age, all of these remains are turning up usually at settlements, field boundaries, or in wells, or other just convenient places to deposit a bit of human bone. And because these are in essentially domestic contexts, it seems logical to say that these were probably being used in ceremonies amongst the living and rituals amongst the living. So the bones from this period, the period that they're being curated for, is slightly slightly lower than in the earlier period. So it seems like they're keeping the human remains coming from these sorts of contexts. They're not keeping them for quite so long. So it's possible a temporal shift there, that in the later periods they were keeping them for they were still keeping them and keeping them for over generations, but slightly less so than in the earlier period. And this might be maybe because there weren't so many accessible graves or older graves that you get in the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. So I think that the sense that you get all the way through the Bronze Age is that, or the way we have to think about it, is that essentially the dead were everywhere and accessible and were considered to be so. And there was no one reason why you would then fetch some human remains or dig up some human bones for use amongst the living. But there was several different ways in which these bones could be used, were almost sort of part of everyday life, that you could imagine this being used in sort of everyday ritual ceremonies, even potentially medicine to some extent. And that they were almost sort of on some level a resource that people knew they could draw upon and knew where to get human remains when they needed them. And they were probably used for potentially lots of different things. So before this is a slight tease for maybe what I'm going to talk about in autumn, but also it's slightly relevant to what I'm going to talk about later. So advances in ancient DNA studies means that we are now regularly picking up genetic relatives in the archaeological record. And a paper I published last week looked specifically at genetic relatives that have been identified in the Bronze Age. And the most remarkable of which is pretty remarkable because no one was intending to, they didn't, these came out of a study that wasn't intending to try and find clusters of relatives. These just came out of sort of almost a random sampling of whatever this ancient DNA lab could get their hands on, and yet they've found this family of people who were distributed around different cemeteries on Amesbury Downs. So you have this man from Wilsford G54 who happens to be in the collections of the Wiltshire Museum, who is the uncle of two men buried at Amesbury Down, who are then paternal cousins. And one of these men is the father of a woman buried a few kilometres away on Porton Down. And what's interesting about this, in thinking about curation and relationships and relatives, is the fact that even though they are, arguably fairly close relatives, particularly the father and the daughter, they're all, three of them at least are buried in totally different cemeteries. You have the two Amesbury Down cousins who are buried near one another. It looks like that they're referencing one another to some extent, but all the rest of them are buried a few kilometers away from each other, suggesting that those relationships didn't have an influence on how they were treated in death, whereas these two cousins were. So we get a sense that sometimes these familial connections were important and sometimes they weren't, in terms of where your remains ended up. So moving on to that, onto some specific examples which sort of exemplify what seems to be going on in certain periods, and provide some interesting snapshots. So this is a burial from of an adult woman from Windmill Fields in Stockton-on-Tees in North Yorkshire, and she was buried along with just cranial remains, so skulls and long bones, so bones of the limbs of 3 other people. And we radiocarbon dated two of the skulls that were accompanying her, and her skeleton had already been dated, and the crania were between 60 and 174 years old when they were buried. But one of these skulls has been tested genetically, and so has this burial, and there doesn't seem to be any relationship in terms of their lineage. This wasn't a direct ancestor of this person. So whilst I'm sure that there was in some cases, and we'll see there's evidence in some cases that a familial connection informed some of these rites, in this it wasn't always about family, and it might in some cases have been more about people who had a significant influence on certain groups of people or societies, or people or who had an influence on particular families, and whose remains persisted to be important over several generations. What's also interesting about Ingleby Barwick, or Stockton Windmill Fields, is that this cemetery site had this wooden box of disarticulated human remains on the same site, and these disarticulated bones are actually exactly the same date as these disarticulated human remains that were in this wooden box. So this sort of feeds into this idea of people sort of caching human remains in these sort of wooden kists for a while and retrieving them for burial with at particular points in time, long after they died, with other people, when other people were being buried at these sites. So this sort of gives direct evidence of these sort of cemeteries as places where you very much interacted with the dead rather than just place the dead. So similarly, the famous Boscombe-Bowman grave, which is a complete articulated burial accompanied by the disordered and incomplete remains and five or six other people. Here, the context has been quite badly truncated, and there might have been some rearrangement quite late on of human remains. So it's difficult to say exactly what position human remains are originally placed in. But again, it's one of these wooden boxes like we see at Windmill Fields. What's interesting is one of the skulls that accompanied the articulated burial was between 261 and 72 years older than the complete burial. But then DNA from another one of the skulls, I think it might be this skull that was placed at his feet, suggested that this person was the paternal cousin or half brother of this articulated burial here. So someone who was essentially of the same generation of this person. And there's a bit of discussion about whether this box whether remains were successively interred in this box and then were sort of moved aside or jumbled around and bits taken out, or whether this body was buried in there and then human remains from different graves were brought and deposited with him. But in this case, you have this mixed thing where you have a person where the potential curation rite, or certainly the rite associated with the manipulation of the dead and their association, was seemingly based on some familial relationship, but then another where it was someone more distant and wouldn't have been such a, if they were a relative, we haven't got the DNA from the one that we radiocarbon dated, but if they were a relative, then they would have been fairly distant from the person that they were buried with. So again, we get this so slightly frustratingly, this picture of a myriad of different ways in which these remains are being thought about and put together and treated. And then moving onto the famous Wilsford G58 musical instrument. This is a human femur, so a human thigh bone that has been carved into what I've seen described as a trumpet or some kind of instrument that you play through, covering holes on the length. And this came from a particularly rich grave with lots of rich and in some cases strange grave goods, all of which you can see at the Wiltshire Museum. And here, I mean, because the bone has been worked and made into something, it's clear that this is obvious curation. And when we did the radiocarbon date, we didn't have the skeleton that it was buried with to compare it to, but we had a look to see if it was broadly the same age range as the typology of the grave goods it was buried with, and it pretty much was. So this suggests that the person that this thigh bone came from was likely possibly even a contemporary of the person that it was buried with, or at least lived not so long earlier than the person that was buried with. So it was likely someone that they maybe even probably even knew in life. So I mean, this, you could imagine thinking about several different scenarios in which might explain what this was used for, whether this person was particularly a skilled musician, and by making his leg into a musical instrument, you were sort of essentially inheriting his skill, or whether you know, it was just his music teacher and he didn't want to play music without him, or whether you know, it's Joanna, co-author, makes this point about it being you know, you're literally making the dead speak, and whether there's a ritual aspect to this, whether this was an important person that people still wanted to somehow commune with after they had died, and making their remains into sort of working their remains in a way which meant that they could make a noise, would mean that you could somehow consult with them. So just to conclude, again, I emphasize this point, that it feels as though the dead were sort of ever present in Bronze Age life, and it was almost maybe to the point of being banal in terms of encountering human remains. And this is partly down to the fact that funerary treatment was highly variable, that there wasn't one way to treat a body, and burial was only one of those ways in which you treated human remains. And it's likely that when they were retained or gathered, they were using all sorts of different things: funerary rites, rites amongst the living, ceremonies, rituals, potentially medicine. And it's likely that the utility and because of the timescales over which they were keeping these things, it seems that the utility and the ritual was based upon the identity of that person in life, and that people knew the person that these remains came from, whether that was because they were in cultural or living memory, and that once they started to pass out of living or cultural memory, that's when they were less interesting. So it's interesting in that even though these remains are sort of disarticulated and are just bits of the person, it seems like they probably maintained aspects of that person's identity, and that it was the proximity of living people to that person which potentially made them powerful. And this suggests an emphasis in these societies on recent tangible past and memories, rather than sort of harking back and trying to reference a sort of mythical, very ancient past, and possibly that they were constantly sort of remaking themselves as societies over the generations in the way and who they decided to reference and in what way. So with that, I'd just like to thank all these people at, first obviously Joe and the people at the Brahms Institute, and all the people who allowed us to radiocarbon date their human remains. So thank you very much.
That's fantastic, Tom. Absolutely fascinating, and great to have the thanks to the museum. Lisa, our curator, does all the hard work, of course. Could I ask if you could stop sharing the
Yes.
the presentation, then everyone gets to see you full screen, I'm afraid, hopefully.
There we go. Sorry, I always do this. I put my camera in front of the stop share. There we go.
That's the one. Yeah. Okay, and they get to see me. Everyone gets to see me as well, which is rather less exciting. But we've got eight questions so far. So a good number coming in. So reminder, if you want to ask a question, to hit the Q&A button and type in. So where are we? Stuart and Pam, or Stuart, yeah, and Pam have said, were the Wilsford, Amesbury and Porton Down relatives complete sets of remains, or could parts of them have been removed from elsewhere or to elsewhere? Could it be just bits that were moved?
No, all of those were complete burials. So complete articulated burials. But I take their point, and one thing I meant to emphasize with stable isotope analysis, and where you basically get an indication from someone's teeth where they grew up as opposed to where they were buried. Some of the movement that we see, because we're seeing potentially human remains being kept amongst the living, and you can imagine circulated amongst the living, that some of the stable isotope results could be about human remains getting moved after they've died rather than movement in life, which is what we typically interpret it as being a result of. So these particular burials, know that it doesn't look like that they were moved about much from what we can tell, but it's definitely, we could certainly say that some of the movement that we see in isotope signatures sometimes could be as a result of movement in death rather than movement in life.
Great. Okay. And Stephen has said right at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about mummification, and you said it was short term. Can you give a ballpark idea of how long that mummification may have gone on for?
Well, there were a couple of mummies, potential mummies in this, and including the ones from Cladhallen in the South Uist on the Western Isles of Scotland. And broadly speaking, it seems like that they fit the same sort of pattern. Maybe they were kept a little bit longer than on average, but it's about the same sort of time scale. Maybe around 60 years on average, but sort of sometimes potentially maybe only over a single generation, but sometimes up to around 6 generations. It seems like that they fit in. And this is the interesting thing in the consistency. It seems like the same kind of patterns, no matter what remains that you look at, is fairly consistent in terms of the time scale with these curated remains.
So that leads on nicely to Annie's question, which is, if you're talking about generations, have you got an idea of sort of average lifespan, lifetime in the period?
I'm assuming around a 30-year time span for a generation. I mean, 25 to 30 years is what particularly evolutionary biologists generally class as a generation for humans, even though it would have probably varied. It probably averages out as around that. I mean, like in a lot of periods, sort of the average age of death would have probably been somewhere in the 30s. But actually, that doesn't give you a good sense of how long people are living for, because infant mortality drags that average down. So basically, if you make it past infancy, then you're likely to live a lot longer, maybe into your 40s, 50s, even 60s. So, most people maybe, well, particularly men, because of the high death rate in childbirth that they would have been, possibly were making it into their 40s and 50s quite regularly. But yeah, generational time is probably something more like 30 years or so, 25 to 30 years.
Yeah. And Mike asked, you were talking about how bits of human remains, bits of people were put in roundhouses. I seem to remember wasn't someone thought to have been put in the rafters of a roundhouse and smoked, if I remember rightly. Would the roundhouses of one family contain the bones of a relatively large number of ancestors, or just one or two, do you think?
I mean, it's hard to say. Yeah, the rafters thing is one of the ideas that they put forward to explain the Cladhallen mummies, that they maybe could have just been put in the rafters and then they would have been smoked naturally by the fire. But I mean, usually they're not. I don't think anyone's found a context that's chock-a-block full of human remains. It tends to be just maybe one or two. I mean, the Cladhallen houses are probably the most interesting evidence of that. I mean, and the most you had, because there were bodies buried underneath the house floors. But there was only ever, I think, as two, at most two people buried under there. And similarly, when you get human remains turning up in sort of post holes of roundhouses and things, it's usually maybe one or two individuals at the most, a lot of the time. So it does seem to be quite restricted in that sense. It wasn't sort of that monastery that's just covered, wallpapered with bones.
Someone's asked, do some dispersed burials of close relatives represent marrying out of a community? And I was thinking that when you were talking about how, I think it was one woman was buried with someone who had no genetic relationship, but could that be, mother-in-law sort of thing?
Yes, it could be, and that's what's been suggested in some cases for where you get relatives dispersed on different cemeteries, particularly in continental Europe, and that could be part of it. Although it's strange, I don't know if they're marrying out, they're not marrying very far to some extent. You know, it's only a few kilometers away, and it could just be into sort of it has to be both men and women based on the dispersal that we see in sort of those Amesbury examples, because you have sort of male relatives dispersed across the landscape as well. So some of it could be, but also we don't have a sense that these cemeteries necessarily always cohabitants. There's so much variation in how the dead are being treated. We can't take it for granted that everyone's being treated in this way, that it seems like people are being selected to be buried in these landscapes. So already, if you use if you refer to sort of marrying out to some extent, there's an assumption there that people are being buried roundabouts where they lived with the people that they lived with. But because we know people are being selected to some extent to be buried in these landscapes, that might not have always been true, and there would have been some particular other criteria that might have messed up that relationship. But it's definitely still a possibility, yes.
Okay. Marianne has asked, did you see any patterns related to the age or gender of people who were or weren't curated?
Yeah, we had a little look at that. It's hard with the sample size, but there wasn't any in the samples that we had, there wasn't any bias either way. I mean, they tended to be adult, but there still were some juvenile and sometimes child remains in there as well. So it wasn't just restricted to adults. It seems like in some cases they were using remains of children as well. So no, there wasn't really any restriction or bias in terms of, and I think this feeds in terms of sex or gender, and I think this feeds into the idea that, you know, to put it in a certain way, everything was sort of fair game, you know, and that, you know, that human remains were sort of just everywhere and around quite commonly, and then they were just being used for potentially lots of different things.
Okay. Anthony Wilson has asked a really interesting question, which is, has similar research been done in Europe?
No, but hopefully it will be. I mean, and that'll be really interesting to compare what's happening, and also this might be preempting a future question, what's happening in Britain in later and earlier periods as well, in that so we accidentally got a few remains that turned out to be Iron Age, and the few ones that we did get that actually dated to the Iron Age, it seemed like that they were keeping the remains for much longer periods of time than we see in the Bronze Age. So this was more like sort of hundreds of years that so certain remains were sort of hundreds of years old before they were deposited. So there seems to be potentially a shift going into the Iron Age of what becomes important, and they do seem to be in the Iron Age harking back to very ancient remains from the very few samples that we've got, and maybe even raiding old, you know, round barrows to fetch human remains. But it's only based on a couple of samples that we found by accident, so it'll be very interesting to explore that more in the Iron Age, but definitely also to see patterns of retention and curation in continental Europe. I'm sure that some examples already exist, as they already existed here before we started this project, but people haven't sort of looked at the radiocarbon dates and compared them in a systematic way yet.
Sarah has asked, does it seem that it's only crania and long bones that are curated, or are those just the ones that survive best?
I think it's predominantly cranial long bones, because it isn't only cranial long bones. There are other skeletal elements that do turn up as well occasionally, but it is definitely predominantly those things. And yeah, it could be because those particularly long bones tend to be quite robust. It could be a survival thing, but it could also be that just there does seem to be, you know, if you think of things like the Jolly Roger and stuff, that people very much associate it's more easy to identify skulls and long bones as being recognizably human, and I think that was that sort of was the point in these relics, and that people could see that they came from human remains, and maybe they wouldn't recognize so much hands and foot bones, ribs, vertebrae. So I feel like maybe there is a preservational bias, but I think that also they were probably selecting those types of bones anyway because they're the ones that are most recognizably human.
Janet's asked if there's any sex difference in the curated remains. So more like, and linked one, whether there's any trend towards step-related groups or late Neolithic related groups. That's from Will.
Yeah, so there didn't seem to be any sex bias in terms of ancestry. There haven't been many of these disarticulated bones that have had DNA analysis done, but the ones that have had the DNA analysis on ancestry-wise, they look just like the burials that have been sampled, although there haven't been that many. You have maybe the skull from the Ames Boscombe Bowman grave and from Ingleby Barwick, and in both cases I think they were both showed similar levels of step ancestry to the population of Britain as a whole, or sort of like beaker related ancestry.
Okay, well, question from Lisa. Sounds a bit like a viva for your doctorate. Can you elaborate on your conclusion in your research paper? Links between the living and the dead were central to the construction of Bronze Age central identities.
Yes, I mean, this mainly comes from Joe's research, but I think it's mainly about because it seems like the human remains was so ever present that and because they seem to be so linked to memory and I guess making of places and peoples, that it seems natural that they would have potentially contributed into people's understanding of themselves and who they were through reference to these people who exist in living memory, like who you think about the times we're living in now, who you choose to remember and why, and how you choose to remember them are all quite important cultural sort of I don't want to say battlefields because it isn't necessarily always a battlefield, but always is the negotiation in terms of who you are as a people and what your values are. So given how likely it was that human remains were seen as something significant amongst these societies, I think it's fair to say that they may have been, and how political they are as well, in terms of, if you think back to like Lenin's mummy and the mummy of Eva Perez, that the way that they've been used politically as well, because they're such powerful totems. I wouldn't expect anything less of what was happening in these Bronze Age communities. So I think it's sort of the power that human remains hold over the people's imagination, as well as the way memory and sort of identity construction is sort of contested and renegotiated. I think that probably feeds into those ideas. Yeah.
And that links to a question from Hannah, whether there's any contemporary ethnographic evidence for similar practices apart from Lenin.
Again, this is not my forte, but I'm pretty sure there's plenty. Again, that's more Joe's domain, and we're planning to write more papers exploring these ideas properly and looking at ethnographic comparisons and more from an anthropological perspective. But sorry, I can't really answer that. I mean, the extreme ones are sort of things like the Teresia in Indonesia, who they mummify their dead by burying them because the ground is quite dry and it desiccates the bodies, and then they bring them out, I think, every few years and feed them and clean them up before they bury them again. So that's a very extreme example. But in terms of human bones, I'm sure there's plenty of examples where human bones particularly are incorporated into rites rather than just mummies.
Yeah, in Tibet, I know there are flutes or trumpets made out of human leg bones, out of femurs. So yeah, very nothing new under the sun. Hazel and someone else who I can't find for the moment have asked us a similar question about the links in the Neolithic, whether there's any evidence of deliberate preservation in Neolithic curated remains.
I mean, we didn't look at this, but there is at least one example of this, where from Warbarrow in Dorset, I think, there was you have like a long barrow that has some remains inside it, but then there's a ditch surrounding the long barrow that has an articulated burial in the ditch. And they recently, well, a few years, well, I say it's recently, it's probably a few years ago now, they radiocarbon dated the human remains in the ditch, and they were basically anomalously too early based on their context. So it looked like that might have been potentially a mummified individual that dated to the Neolithic. Also in certain chamber tombs, certain barrows, not all of them, where you have disarticulated human remains, there's some suggestion that in some cases some of the human remains were already old, or were older than when the barrow was, or the chamber of the tomb was built. So again, there's some evidence in the Neolithic that people explored a little bit, suggesting that people were bringing older remains from elsewhere and potentially also preserving the dead. But I don't, as far as I know, it's not something that's been looked into in great detail, I don't think.
Tim has said, in your research, did you notice any regional commonalities or differences between the Chalcolithic, Early Bronze Age and Late Bronze Age, Iron Age periods? I.e., was mummification more common in the Southwest, for example?
It's hard to say, because these projects have been on very much a national scale, because that's what's required to get a decent number of samples a lot of the time across lots of different sites. So it's hard to say, and so you only have, maybe like one or two from certain regions, and you get an overrepresentation of others. You can see in that map that I showed that we have a total overrepresentation of southern Britain in this kind of studies, just because that's where the material's being excavated and where it comes from. So it's difficult to say. I mean, the mummies came from all over Britain, from Kent all the way up to Western Scotland. So there's a sense that I'm sure there are regional variations in how this is used, but we just don't have we just don't have the evidence for it for now, unfortunately.
Okay, I'm now, I think, nearing the end of our time. I think I'm just going to promote a couple of people to be panelists, to give you ask you some questions. So first of all will be Susan Greeny, who is properties historian for English Heritage and looks after Stonehenge amongst her other the other things she looks after. So hi, Susan.
There we go. Hi. Hello.
Susan's generously offered also to give us the one of the next talks in our series, which is about her research at down in Dorchester. We're doing that jointly with the Dorset Archaeological Society.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That was great. I just wanted to ask about, I was interested in the idea of these relics being kind of kept and then potentially decommissioned when the person went out of living memory. And you've obviously got the example of your musical instrument that was created from one of these examples, or that wasn't necessarily kept that long. And I know there's another example that we have on from one of the Normanton Down burials, I think, in David's collection, which is a little piece of skull bone that was covered in gold. I just wondered if you had any other examples from either the samples you looked at or other ones that you know of, where bone has been modified, either perforated or, might give some suggestion of what's been done with in the intervening period, and also whether it's possible to do use wear on bones. I mean, can you look and see if they've been kind of really well handled or stored in particular ways?
Yeah, some people seem to think so, that some people often describe certain human remains as being worn or sort of polished, almost like they've been handled a lot. And some of the remains that I looked at, particularly from, I think there's a couple of midden sites that I looked at that had those features. What it tends to be more of, obviously that case that you were talking about and the musical instrument are really incredibly exceptional cases where you get such clear evidence for working. What you have more evidence of every now and again is, I'm thinking there was definitely some from the Potter and Midden, where they've been deliberately seemingly chopped into pieces or chopped into little squares. I don't think there's any evidence for perforation there, but there's definite evidence for very crude working where things have been sort of resized essentially. There are other human remains that we didn't get a chance to sample, but like from is it Green Park, I think it's called, near Reading, something like that, where there are bits of human skull that do show perforations. But yeah, besides that, there's just little things like where it looks like that they've been chopped into pieces, or like you said, may have been handled a little bit. But yeah, nothing so spectacular as those two that you mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, if I can chip in here, the bit from Normanton Down you mentioned has been covered in gold, and unfortunately we can't. I'm not going to let Tom drill holes in it yet, because it could be human or it could be sheep or goat.
Oh, okay.
That was the best I could get out of the specialists who looked at it when the whole collection was being crawled over. But we've got
Make me sound like a bloodthirsty maniac, David.
But you are, except there's no blood. You're just a maniac.
Yeah, bone powder thirsty maniac.
Yeah. So when we got you can sort of zap it with a laser, then we'll get it get the DNA looked at. Can't wait. Hope that happens.
You might be able to do it
in my lifetime.
You might be able to do it non-destructively with zooms potentially, or with only a slight little bits. This is zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, where they only take a tiny little piece. But anyway, sorry, this is a digression. Yeah. Anyway,
okay.
Sorry.
Well, next research project, perhaps.
Yes, I could.
We can talk about it.
Yes.
Can I be cheeky and ask a second question?
Oh, well, okay. Hang on, I haven't finished yet.
Oh,
the other thing is we've got two fittings from Bronze Age dagger sheaths, which are both made of human bone. They're both tibias, and they're both highly decorated. One of them is really highly polished. And they're probably more kicking about that just haven't, well, there may be more kicking about that haven't been recognized.
Well, it's also hard to recognize.
Wilsford somewhere, I can't remember the barrows, but they were pre-Cunnington antiquarian, so it was Cunnington dug them, but they'd already been dug into before Cunnington's day. So that's it.
Some bone toggles have been speculated to have been made of human remains as well, but when they've been worked so extensively, it's sometimes difficult to tell without destructive or intrusive analysis. Yeah.
Go on, Susan.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So my other question was about some of the earliest Chalcolithic remains that you looked at, and some of those populations that look to have had at least some of them coming over from the continent at the earliest point of the Bronze Age. Is it possible that people were bringing some relics with them of individuals who were living on the continent? And is that something that we can look at using isotopes, or is that sort of to be seen in the future?
It's possible, definitely, theoretically possible. The issue tends to be if you have any teeth in the particular relic that has been brought over. But yeah, it would be interesting to look into that. And again, it'll be hard to say for sure whether they moved in life or in death. I was thinking this a little bit about those two females I mentioned from Cotswold community. They were very early. I mean, not completely out of the realms of I can't remember exactly the dates, of possibility beyond sort of like the threshold, but still really early in the sort of Beaker time period. So I was wondering whether those, because they were just two femurs, you could have just put them in a bag, whether they could have been carried over. You could definitely conjecture that could have been the case, because they were so early. The odds are you could push them a bit later in terms of when they came over, and then have their date of death actually being they died in the continent and then the remains were brought over, and that's why it's sort of really pushing up the sort of earliest, because they were buried with Beaker pottery as well, and they were curated, so they were older than there was some seeds and other things in the context with them. There was actually lots of datable stuff in that context. It was really useful, and they were early. The human bone was earlier than all of it. So just because it's very early and because it's older than the point at which it was deposited, I kind of had a feeling about those that perhaps they had been, transported over by someone. But it's a hard thing to prove, because obviously they have no teeth to be able to look at the.
Yeah, although if you looked at the bone, at least you'd get the last sort of 10 years of their life, wouldn't you? So that might give you an indication of whether they're living here or.
Yeah, but the difficulty with strontium is, well, you could do oxygen, yeah. The difficulty with strontium is that you tend to get the diagenesis just produces the degradation of the bone, I think, affects the strontium so that it's not reliable of the place where they grew up. It's just the environment, I think.
Okay.
That's why you need teeth a lot of the time, although I think you could probably do oxygen though.
Okay, thank you.
And just interesting on that, of course, the Neolithic cremations at Stonehenge almost certainly buried in little bags. So again, you wonder if, and that some of those people come from the west, southwest or Wales. And again, you wonder if it's the bag that's moving, not the person.
Yeah,
But,
a few have really early radiocarbon dates too.
Sure. But I digress. If I can now bring in someone else, who's Alison Sheridan, who was the curator at National Museums of Scotland. I think is still the president of the Prehistoric Society, if I remember rightly. So Alison should be joining us.
Yes.
Hi, Alison.
Hi, hello. I'm so sorry. I've had some internet problems here. I just really I'm your biggest fangirl. Just want to say how wonderful all your work is. And in particular, in mining the information that is buried in the supplementary information bits of other articles. So all your stuff on relatedness is absolutely fantastic. And just a little comment on the Dryburn Bridge individual that you showed at the very, very beginning. This one is particularly interested. It's a child who's 6 or 7 years old and has been suspected osteologically of having leprosy. And this was recently tested for Stuart T. Cole, who runs the Pasteur Institute. And unfortunately, the results they weren't completely diagnostic. But that's one, maybe that was a particularly interesting individual in that society. And as you know, we've been trying to test with pairs of people who've been found in kists, were they related to each other? And so often, unfortunately, the preservation of the DNA isn't good enough to tell for sure. But have you found many instances of those? Likewise, we know people were fiddling around in kists. So at Skaterraw in East Lothian, the left arm was then reburied where the right arm should have been. So people went in, fiddled around, and then closed the lid again. And also there are clear cases where you'd have one unburnt body, and then you might have deposits of cremated remains. Have you been able to date those to see if if they were curating the cremated remains and then popping them in later?
Was there one? I think we did. We were a bit hesitant to look at cremated remains because the problem with cremation, I mean, we did look at some, but they tended to be where we had multiple cremations in an urn, or there was one particularly spectacular example from Witton Hill, I think, where you have a kist with just the cremated remains of 25 people inside it. So, I mean, clearly there's been some curation of cremations, and they've just sort of dumped them all into this one kist at the end. But we wanted to basically, what happens with cremation is that there can be carbon while the bodies are burning, there can be carbon exchange between the bone and the wood. And if you're burning them using old wood, it means they get this old wood effect. So obviously, like wood like oak, the heartwood of oak forms sort of hundreds of years previously to when the tree gets chopped down. So it makes things look older than they're supposed to be. They take on they start to take on a profile of the wood that's burning them. So if you get a good sample of the pyre material, then you can make sure that they were burned using short-lived material and be sure that the old wood effect's not happening. But particularly when you're comparing a cremation against an unburnt body, you can never completely rule out the possibility that if you do get an older date, that's because of the old wood effect on cremations. And it's interesting in that the first article that noted this possible old wood effect on cremations was actually exactly as you say, a Bronze Age. I can't remember, somewhere in continental Europe. It was a Bronze Age burial where you had an articulated body with a cremation in the burial with it, and they said that, and the cremation was older, significantly older, and they said that, oh, this must be the old wood effect. But I mean, actually, you can say that it could be the old wood effect, or it could be that this cremation was already old when it was deposited in the burial. But I mean, what's interesting and what we note in our paper is that despite this possibility of there being an old wood effect on the cremations, we get the same sort of pattern of curation amongst the cremations in terms of their dates than we do amongst the unburnt stuff. So there doesn't seem to be any, if the old wood effect was having a really significant effect all the time, we'd expect that the cremation dates would be all over the place. But they're really rather consistent and very similar to the dates that we get on the unburnt bone. So at the moment, I think we have good evidence on the balance of probabilities. I would say that they were definitely curating cremated bone as well. The best example of this was, there's a kist in Trellothas in Cornwall, where there's a kist and it's full of cremated bones of lots of people, and then you have an urn with the cremated remains of 2 people stuck in the top, and the remains of the 2 cremated people in the urn were older than the remains of the people that were in the kist. So clearly they've kept the cremated remains in an urn amongst people for a while. Other people have been cremated and put in this kist, and then they just stuck, at some point they decided to stick this urn full of cremated bone into the top of it. So I think we can say, rather than it being all wood effect, that in some cases they definitely were curating cremated bone. It's just hard to say absolutely outright that they, without sort of sifting through loads of pyre material, that there's definitely no wood effect here. But yeah, I suspect that the same thing's going on with cremations.
Thank you.
Can I have the luxury of firing a question at Alison? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but you've talked about necklaces, how necklaces in the Bronze Age are often assembled from bits of other people. It's a bit like weddings, where you have something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think there's any sort of relationship between what's going on with human remains and what's going on with necklaces?
Oh, blimey. Oh, they were both very, very highly valued, clearly, culturally very, very significant. I can't give you a pat answer to that. I can say that certainly with the necklaces, the importance was in underlining the links between people of the same generation and the links between people of different generations. So you might have one bead that could be 200 years old or 300 years old, you know, and your necklace is made up of all the things which link you to your ancestors and to the other people who are culturally important to you. And so in a way, there's no reason why human remains shouldn't have been used in the same way. But what's so valuable about Tom's work is that Tom, you're able to put the detail into the chronological patterning of who was doing what with bones at what point. And in fact, one of the most interesting things I found was your contrast between the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age and the Middle and later Bronze Ages, where you still have cremation as the primary, the main, the dominant practice. And yet it's with the unburnt bones that they, you know, it's most obvious that they're doing interesting things with them.
Yeah, fantastic. Any thoughts, Tom or Susan? Don't have to.
Yeah. I mean, that's really something that we still haven't totally unpicked properly. But yeah, there does seem to be a difference between this transition into the Middle and Late Bronze Age compared to the earlier period, and in lots of different ways. And it seems, like I said, it seems like that they're maybe not keeping things quite for so long. So yeah, it's interesting that you thought that was interesting as well, that it was significant. Yes, it's useful to know. Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, I think it's almost 9 o'clock, so we kept you for an hour and a half, despite you being fortified by a glass of beer, which is a bottle of beer, which I'm glad to see. So a very big thank you to Tom and to Susan and for Alison for being put on the spot. It's been really fascinating talk. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's come along. Yeah. We still haven't cracked virtual applause on this, but thank you so much. And we
can have little emojis on certain Zoom calls where you can do little clap hands, but it doesn't have them on these ones.
Yeah, not on this one, I think. And we can look forward to hearing more from Sue. Susan, I think it's next month, isn't it? Can't remember. Sometime soon. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.